Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Chabura public shiur. Today, Rabbi Zarnighian of Mikveh Israel, the S&P community in Philadelphia, will be sharing with us for the third week insights on Hanukkah. The previous 2 weeks have been shiurim on Teshuvot, and tonight we will be talking about women in miracles, specifically during Hanukkah. Tonight's shiur is dedicated L'Ilui Nishmat Yitzhak ben Alexander, and also for Refuah Shelema for Sarah Miriam Bat Dina. So the learning we'll do tonight is dedicated to them. Without further delay, Chacham, when you're ready.
All right, to everyone joining us from Kol Arba Kanfot Haaretz, from across the world, we welcome you to a wonderful shiur that focuses on one of my favorite themes of Hanukkah, which is a rule that the Talmud introduces us to, known as Af hen hayu ve'oto hanes. Women were also in this miracle. We will, of course, unpack what that means exactly and point out its relevance with regard to the mitzvah of Hadlakat Me'orot Hanukkah. So if we can have the screen sharing enabled. There we go. Now, the first and most important question that we have to ask is, why would women not be obligated? What is the hava amina? What is the thought that would even lead one to think that women would be exempt from anything? Especially in this postmodern age of egalitarianism, we would like to think that women would be hayavot, obligated in all the mitzvot just as men are. So for that, you have to jump to the Mishnah and Kiddushin. The Mishnah and Kiddushin in the first chapter relates to us a series of very important kilalim. They're general rules with regard to who is obligated in what category of mitzvot. And these are, as I stated, general rules, because as we'll see in further sources, there are exceptions. There are always exceptions to the rule. Hence, the other rule, which states en lemedim min haklalot, we don't derive case-specific examples of halacha from the general rules that Chachamim provide. Now, the first Mishnah, the Mishnah and Kiddushin in the first chapter over here relates as follows: V'chol misvat aseh she'azeman gerama. All time-bound mitzvot. Those are mitzvot which are contingent upon either the date of the year or upon the hour of the day. Anashim chayavim, men are obligated, and then v'nashim peturot, women are exempt. If you have something that is not time-bound, then chad anashim ve'chad nashim chayavim. Everyone is obligated in them as long as they are adults, all Jewish adults. Any restrictive commandment, ben shazaman gerama, ben shelo azaman gerama, whether it is a time-bound or not time-bound, likewise, echad anashim ve'echad nashim chayavim. All Jews are obligated to observe them, with the exception of chutz mibal tashchit, uval takif, uval titma ametim. With the exception of the prohibition of bal tashchit, this is not to be confused with the colloquialism of bal tashchit, which is restricted to destroying usable objects, in particular fruit-bearing trees during wartime. So that's not what this is referring to. This is referring to the prohibition of hashchatat peot harosh, the rounding of one's the temples of one's hair. Bal takif being in reference to shaving one's beard with a razor, and bal titman ametim, the prohibition of kohanim defiling themselves by entering a cemetery. So a woman, for example, who is a kohenet, is allowed to enter a cemetery if she's from a family of kohanim, or conversely, if she's married to a kohen, and there's no issue for her to do that. Although, as a side point, the Mishnah, the Rishonim do debate whether or not she is obligated to be mitamela metim if she has to go to a cemetery for a funeral procession for a immediate family member. There's some discussion over there regarding that. In source 2, Rambam in his Perush Mishnayot, and I have over here the portion from the Perush Mishnayot in Hanuka 5th edition, which is why it is not typed. But if you look from the number 28 mark on the right side of the page, by the way, Hanuka 5th's translation from the original Arabic is of preference to me, which is why I have it and not the typed version. So, mitzvah says she'azaman garama. Here, Harambam tells us that the mitzvot which are contingent upon time include, he gives you a few examples. Tigon sukkah, like sitting in the sukkah, ve'alulav, and waving the lulav, ve'ashofar, sounding the shofar, and ve'atfilin, ve'tzitzit, lefi shechovatan bayom ve'lo balayla. You see, he gives you a few examples. He gives you examples relating to time-bound mitzvot regarding the calendar and also time-bound mitzvot regarding the clock. So these are all contingent upon the sense of time, and therefore women are exempt from them. It goes without saying, by the way, women are allowed to fulfill them under most circumstances, but they're not obligated to do so. What's an example of a mitzvah that's not time-bound? Everybody has to put mezuzah on their doors. You have to put a fence around your roof if the roof is accessible, giving tzedakah. And then Rambam says, we have a canon of not generalizing when the Mishnah gives you rules. That's why these are exceptions. That's why the following are going to be exceptions to the rule the Mishnah just told us. Now, Rambam goes on to say something that's very, I suppose, disappointing to many, but he says, Bechol hekefan, in all of the containment regarding these exceptions to the rule, en lahen kelal ela nimsarim al peh. There is no formula to use to calculate what type of mitzvot are going to be obligatory and not obligatory for men and women. They are passed down al peh by means of judicial tradition, and they're recorded in the Talmud and the rabbinic literature, which, even though the Talmud does provide for us, the Gemara in Kiddushin, for example, does provide for us various reasons for why women are exempt from time-bound mitzvot, but every exception has its own reasoning as well, and therefore there's no specific formula. Behem dvarim mekubalim. These are canons which are at the discretion of the court. They are a received tradition of the court, and that's why the Chachamim, our sages, are able to transmit and tell us what they are accordingly. And then Rambam goes on to tell us that we can give you some examples of the exceptions. For example, eating of the matzah, the mitzvah to be joyous on the Moadim, on Jewish holidays, the hakel, gathering the nation for the mitzvah for the king to read from the Torah on Shabbat Chol HaMoed Sukkot. Tefillah, Harambam's opinion, unlike others, is that women are also obligated in the mitzvah of tefillah. Mikra Megillah, reading of the Megillah. Ner Hanuka, that's relevant to our purposes. They're obligated in lighting the Hanukkah candles. Ner Shabbat, lighting the Shabbat candles. Kiddush, and so on. So, without going into further example, I would like to unpack in source number 3, the Gemara on Shabbat, Daf Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph. The Gemara gives us the first reasoning for including women in the mitzvah of lighting Hanukkah candles. The Gemara concludes a prior discussion which concludes, now that we've concluded that the fundamental aspect, by the way, we touched on this point in the last shiur we gave regarding Chacham Mesas's Teshuvah, lighting the Hanukkah candles with electrical bulbs. So the Gemara here concludes that the fundamental aspect of the mitzvah of lighting the Hanukkah candles is the actual lighting of the candles. If that's true, hidlika cheresh shoteh v'katan. If a deaf mute or mentally incompetent or a minor individual lights the candles, these are individuals who are not obligated in mitzvot normally. Lo asa v'lo chilum. It's as if the mitzvah was not completed. The Gemara retorts and says, Isha vaday madlika. No. It's true that generally speaking, these category of individuals are not obligated in many mitzvot, if not all the mitzvot. But a woman is certainly not included in that category. The Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi tells us, Nashim chayavot ben Hanukkah. Women are obligated in lighting the Hanukkah candles, regardless of their marital status. She'afin hayu be'oto hanes. But they were also included in that miracle. Now, Rashi over here, in his commentary, he makes a comment that's a little bewildering, and we touched on this actually in our first class regarding in this series from the Chacham Sevi. So he makes a comment, and he states, "Shegazru Yevanim al kol habetulot hanesuot lehiba'el et asar techila ve'al yad isha na'asa hanes." The Greco-Romans had made various decrees against the Jewish people. One of those decrees, as the Gemara records, is that the imperial troops would commit horrible acts of abuse against Jewish women who were getting married prior to them getting married. And it was through the famous episode of Yehudit that the Jewish women were saved from this terrible form of abuse. Why does Rashi choose to identify this as the miracle? So you'll notice, number one, this is a woman-specific inclusion that the Gemara is making, and so Rashi likely felt compelled to give a reason that was case-specific to women. Alternatively, Rashi is focusing on the singular nature that Gemara's language that the Gemara is making. The Gemara says that they were in otohanes, that miracle, singular, not plural. And so he chooses to identify a specific miracle. Tosafot, however, point out that while this is certainly a nice diuk, it's a nice form of it's a nice implication that Rashi, a nice form of deduction that Rashi is deriving from the language of the Talmud. But he says the kasheh. This is in the third line. It's difficult to say this. The lashon she'af hen. Tosafot chooses to focus instead on another clause in this line from the Talmud. They too were included in the miracle. Mashma shehen tefilot. When you use the word they too, this implies that the primary salvation for the Jewish people was on the nation as a whole, not just the women. And so women were also included in the miracle, and therefore they're obligated to light the Hanukkah candles. But they weren't the main source, the main protagonist, if you will, in the miracles that we are celebrating during Hanukkah. The Talmud should have instead, according to Rashi and Rashbam's deduction, the Talmud should have said hen hayu be'oto hanes, not af hen. The Chaf Nireh Li, Tosafot then chooses to offer instead שאף הן היו בספק להשמיד ולהרוג. They were also in the general decree of the Greek or Romans to exterminate the Jewish people, or to, according to some scholars, exterminate the Jewish people by assimilating them. And Tosafot tries to prove this point by stating, V'chen bePesach, also during Pesach, where women were also subject to Paro's decrees. V'chen beChanuka, hagzera hayta me'od alehem. The decrees during the Jewish people to assimilate and annihilate us were also certainly inclusive of the women as well, especially bearing in mind that, Jewish women are the source of Jewish identity and what keep the generations of Jews alive, God willing, forever and ever. So if you keep this point in mind, we can at least identify why this is the exception to the general rule of women not being included in time-bound mitzvot. Here they would be obligated to light the Hanukkah candles for one of these two reasons. Piskei HaRosh in source number 5, Rabbeinu Asher, the great Rishon, the great medieval decisor of Jewish law, he points out in his restatement of halachot to Masechet Megillah that there is one little caveat that we have to attach to this. From the first underlined mark, he points out, Ubal halachot pasat she'anashim enan chayavot ela b'shmiya, aval kiryata ena motzia anashim yedei chovatan shechayavim b'kriya ad sheyishmu mpi anashim hamechoyavim b'kriya kamotan. And he says over here basically that the obligation for women exists with regard to another mitzvah that women are obligated in because of the miracle of their salvation, of being saved from death and destruction. And that is the mitzvah of listening to the Megillah on Purim being read. Now, the Talmud leaves with no ambiguity. It leaves us assuming and pretty unequivocally stated that women are obligated to hear the Megillah as well. However, the Baal Halachot, which is, by the way, I believe a 9th century work of halakha, it's one of the earliest works of Jewish law that we have from the period of the Geonim, points out that they are obligated, but they are not obligated to recite the Megillah. They are obligated to listen to the Megillah. And consequently, if that is the case, they would be obligated to attend a Megillah, we'll say a Megillah service, or hypothetically, somebody could read the Megillah for them, a man could read the Megillah for them privately, but they could not take it upon themselves to read the Megillah for others. Now, why would Halachot Gedolot conclude this when the Talmud tells us otherwise? So here, the Baal Halachot quotes a passage from the Tosefta. Tosefta, a work of rabbinical restatements of law, containing braitot from the school of Rabbi Chia, teachings from the school of Rabbi Chia. It's a wonderful parallel to the Mishnah. If anyone studies the Mishnah, it's very helpful always to study the Tosefta side by side with it. So the Tosefta says something that throws us a little off guard. Nashim va'avadim uktanim peturim mimikra Megillah. It says in the Tosefta that women, indentured servants, those of you who know me know I don't like to use the term slaves because I think that's an inaccurate translation of the Hebrew term Ived, but that's a discussion for another time. And minors are exempt from the mitzvah of reciting the Megillah. And they do not have the ability legally to fulfill the obligation of others by reading it. And if you say that, we are left with a conflict between the Talmud and the Tosefta. The Talmud includes the women in the mitzvah of Megillah and hearing the Megillah. The Tosefta exempts them. So for this, The Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, cites a passage from the Talmud Yerushalmi. The Talmud Yerushalmi, in a way, I don't want to say reconciles, but bridges these two statements of our Chachamim, of the sages. The Yerushalmi, in the second chapter of Megillah, states, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, have machnesh kal anshe beto v'koreh lifnehem Megillat Esther. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was accustomed, he had the practice of gathering his entire household, and he read the Megillah for them as a family. But Rabbi Yonah, Abuah, the Rabbi Mana, היה התכוון לקרותה לפני הנשים שבביתו, שהכל היו בספק. Rabbi Yonah, father of Rabbi Mana, would have the practice of gathering the women in his household to fulfill for them their obligation of Megillah, because they were also included in Haman's decrees against the Jewish people. Everybody is obligated to hear the Megillah. Now, you could read this passage in the Yerushalmi in one of two ways. You can either read it in light of the Tosefta and say that women are obligated in hearing it but not in reading it. Therefore, you need a man to read it for them. As we'll see, you can also simply dismiss the Tosefta, and the Tosefta's ruling would therefore be rejected as a matter of accepted law. And the Yerushalmi over here then would simply be a record of minhag. It was the practice among these rabbis to fulfill the mitzvah for their households in this manner. There's a question, there's a discussion among the Rishonim as to why that is, as we'll see in a moment. But you could also read this passage in the Yerushalmi to read that women just weren't accustomed to reading the Megillah publicly. It's just not something they did. So you have the head of the household do it. The Rosh doesn't reconcile these passages this way, though. Besarich letaretz. Therefore, we're compelled, the Rosh says, to provide the following reconciliation on behalf of the Halachot Gedolot and Tosefta, based on another passage in the Talmud in Masechet Arachin, Hakol Ksherin Likrot. Everybody is fit. All Jews can read the Megillah. La'atuye nashim. This includes women. Lo sheyotziu anashim. Not that they fulfill obligation in their reading for men, bikriyatan. Ela davka nashim. Instead, the Rosh says women can fulfill the obligation of other women because they're obligated on the same level. L'latema af nashim enan yotzeot el bikriya chashuva shel nashim. So that you don't come to say, you shouldn't say that women cannot fulfill those who are obligated on the same level as them. That's what the Gemara in Arachin is coming to teach us. Women are obligated, meaning what? They're obligated in the sense that they can fulfill the mitzvah on those who are obligated on their within their legal parameters. But not that they cannot fulfill the mitzvah, period. Obviously they could, because they're obligated in it. So the Rosh concludes that we learn from this that a woman can fulfill another woman's obligation in the reading of the Megillah, and presumably the same holds true for the lighting of the Hanuka candles. That she cannot light for her husband, but she could light for, let's say, other women who are roommates of hers. Like we discussed in our class on Chacham Sevi's Teshuvah, the mitzvah of Hanuka candles and lighting them is a household-based mitzvah, not an individual one. So other people in the household could also include themselves in the lighting of Hanukkah candles with a woman. That's probably most common in the dormitory case example, where you have women who are living together in a dormitory, or if they're not in school, but let's say you have Jewish women who are renting an apartment together, and so that would suffice for all of them. Now, the Ritba, Rabbi Yom Tov Seville from Spain, from Seville, 14th century, he categorically rejects the position of the Tosefta and of the Rosh and of others. And in context over here, he's also discussing Megillah. And he states very simply in the underlined passage, when the Talmud says that women are kosher, they're obligated to read the Megillah, and they have that obligation on Purim. Mashma likro la'acherim. This also implies that they're fit legally to read Megillah for others. V'amrinan ba'arafin. Now you'll tell me there's a Gemara in Arafin that we just read that everybody's obligated in the Megillah reading to include women. La tuye mai nashim bedumya dematnitin mar bedehu. It's similar to the Mishnah and Megillah over here that includes women in the obligation to listen to the Megillah and presumably to read the Megillah. We say the same regarding Hanukkah candles that they could light for others. Since they're obligated in them. Now, it should be Tosefta. That which it states in the Tosefta, Nashim Avadim Muktanim Peturim Mikra Megillah, it says that they're in the Tosefta that we just read that they're exempt. Notice the Ritva doesn't try to reconcile the language of the Tosefta. The Tosefta, he takes at face value. They're simply exempt according to the language that's used there. If you notice the language that Tosefta uses, it doesn't even invoke the canon of that women are obligated in the lighting of Hanukkah candles or Megillah reading because of the salvation that Borei Olam, that God provided for all Jewish people. That obligates women as well. And therefore, if the Tosefta doesn't invoke that canon, it's a rejected position. He calls it a shibush, literally a grave error. And so, concluding his point over here, Ritman writes, excuse me. Since we instead are compelled to conclude that the Talmud's ruling, the Talmud Bavli's ruling, which invokes the canon of Afen Hayubot Ones, includes them in being obligated, we must conclude that's the correct position to follow as a matter of halakha l'maaseh, practical application of the law. Except we can invoke another canon unrelated to the Tosefta, which is brought up in the Talmud in Masechet Megillah further on regarding the institution of reading Torah in public, where the Talmud invokes another canon of Kavod HaSibur. I'm not going to get into what Kavod HaSibur is this moment. We'll get to it in a little bit. But the institution of Kavod HaSibur would restrict women from public recitation of Megillah and Torah reading, not that they can't fulfill the obligation of others, but that it is not the preferred method to fulfill the obligation of others in these mitzvot. Then bichlal me'era, and they are included in what the rabbis of the Talmud, what the Chachamim would categorize as curse should fall on someone who uses a woman to fulfill their mitzvah. Very harsh language. We'll unpack what that means as well. Okay? Aval hacha, but here in the case of reading the Megillah, en shinui b'mikra Megillah, v'lo b'birchotea, ben yachid le v'la chashiv tzeruf kulehai. Here, we're not going to invoke this canon because, and nor are we going to invoke this rule with regard to women reciting the berachot for the Megillah, because they are not needed for the required minyan, where otherwise Chachamim were concerned, the nechush lifritzuta, where Chachamim were, the sages were concerned for promiscuity and improper behavior if you gather men and women in such a capacity to fulfill a mitzvah. Right? Hence the institution of zimun, when Jews gather together and break bread with one another. The Birkat Hamazon is recited by men in the zimun. There's some discussion if women can also recite their own zimun if they're just women and no one else, but typically for this concern, Chachamim had that women do not lead the zimun, men lead the zimun, and women can join, of course, as is our practice. But with regard to the reading of the Megillah and the lighting of the Hanukkah candles, this doesn't apply. Therefore, because it doesn't apply because you don't need 3 people or 10 people. You could theoretically even have 2 people. Hilkach, therefore, in the final passage, an underlined mark, einam elev de pirsumei nisa be'alma, v'la chashiv tzeru kulehai, kevan demchayavot b'nikra Megillah, misarafot, mipi mori. He's quoting his teacher, Rabbi Aaron Halevi, another great rabbi from Spain, who writes that since the reading of the Megillah in public is done for the sake of pirsumei nisa, of glorifying the miracle, and not for the purposes of fulfilling a quota like zimun or like praying in a minyan, the synagogue is concerned, we must conclude that they can be a part of the mitzvah to fulfill the obligation of others, and in this sense, they are mitzdarefot. They are included in those who would be equally obligated with men, and so they could light, let's say, in one's home or in another setting where there are other people, and there's no concern with this whatsoever. The Or Zarua, source 7, kind of reiterates this point, except he explicitly rejects the position of the Tosefta that we cited earlier, but for a different reason. He says that it's not mentioned in the Talmud. This is a very tricky area that applies to principles of halakha in general. When do we give weight to sources in the rabbinic literature that are not stated in the Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud? There are different canons that the Rishonim provide for us with regard to, let's say, invoking the Talmud Yerushalmi, or the Tosefta, or the Sifra, or the Sifre, or the Mechilta, and other sources, even from non-halakhic midrashim, where the Talmud is silent. Almost nobody is of the opinion that where there is a direct contradiction between the Talmud Bavli and other sources, that we give supremacy to other sources. But where the Talmud Bavli is silent, it's not so clear when and how we invoke other sources. Those are often very case dependent. So Rabbi Yitzhak of Vienna, one of the late Baalei Tosafot from the 13th century, he's of the opinion with regard to this specific case that we simply reject the Tosefta because it's rejected by the Talmud. It's an explicit contradiction to the passage in the Talmud that states that women are obligated. Now, I also quote the passage from the Or Zarua. Oh, you know what? That's actually a source we'll get to in a little bit. Actually, we'll skip the rest of this for now. Source number 8 and 9. We will also read outside, but it's a good reference. The Meiri, Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri of Provence, usually takes a more inclusive approach with regard to a more open approach, I should say, with regard to many areas of halakha. Here, he's of the opinion that women are certainly not obligated to fulfill the mitzvah on the same level as men. And he concludes in the bottom paragraph here, the rabbis of Provence, all of them conclude in their works, he's probably referring to the Baal HaShlama, Rabbi Abraham Av Bet Din of Narbonne, and other Chachmei Provence from the Middle Ages, were of the opinion as follows. Just like women are obligated in Birkat Hamazon and also to join the Zimun if they eat a meal with the family or with others, but that they don't count for the numbers, the quota that is needed for fulfilling these mitzvot, lishlosha, for 3 or for 10, like is needed in the Zimun. כך הן מצטרפות כאן לעשרה למי שמצריך בה עשרה, וכל שכן שלא להוציא את האנשים. You see, Meiri makes a very interesting distinction. The Ritva said, remember what the Ritva said. The Ritva said earlier, you can fulfill the mitzvah of Megillah you can fulfill it by yourself. You could be alone in your home, read the Megillah, and then you're done. The Ritva says, no, not so fast. Because you do have an element of fulfilling the mitzvah on a higher level where you have more people. Either because of Pirsumei Nisa, publicizing and glorifying the miracles of Hanuka and Purim to the masses, to as many people as possible, or alternatively, we quoted from the Orchot Chaim, who quotes a version of the Talmud Yerushalmi in our lecture 2 weeks ago, that for the blessing of Haravet Rivenu, the final blessing made on the reading of the Megillah, in nowadays it's taken for granted, but the Talmud says this is the final blessing that's made on after the reading of the Megillah. The Talmud Yerushalmi adds you need to have a minyan for that, and so if women cannot include themselves as the quota required for these elements of the mitzvah, they must not be on the same legal level of obligation to fulfill these mitzvot for men. And so the Meiri, for reasons slightly different than that offered by the Baal Halachot Gedolot, concludes with Baal Halachot Gedolot in conclusion, but for different reasons, that the women would not be able to read the Megillah for men, but that they could read it for themselves and for other women. In source number 9, it's an interesting comment he makes. In the final underlined marks, he says, "V'chen adin noten." It's logically compelling to say that women are not obligated on the same level of hearing the Megillah, reading the Megillah as are men. How could she say the beracha asher kiddushanu v'tzvanu al mikra Megillah? How could you say the blessing of reading the Megillah when she's really exempt according to the Tosefta? The Tosefta uses that language that they're exempt. Okay, they're not really exempt, but that's the language that Tosefta uses. Umikol makom, he says, it's a bewildering comment from the Meiri. He says that a minor, unlike a woman, is able to make the beracha. Hoil v'yesh lo shaychut b'Talmud Torah. This is a very bewildering comment. So, forgive me. So, actually, forgive me. Here, the Meiri is commenting not on the institution of Megillah, but on the institution of reading the Torah on Mondays, Thursdays, and on Shabbat. A woman is not obligated in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. That's based on the famous comment the Talmud makes in a number of places. You have to teach the words of the Torah to your sons. The Gemara derives and deduces, and not your daughters. So men are obligated to study Torah, and so they also fulfill the obligation of reciting the Torah for others, but not women. So how could she say the bracha of reading the Torah, Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim, when she's not obligated in Talmud Torah? It doesn't make sense. But he says that doesn't apply to a minor, because a minor has an obligation to study Torah, and others are also obligated to teach him Torah. This is it's a puzzling comment of the Meiri because he invokes a canon the Talmud does not mention. V'yesh lo shaychut. There's some legal relevance or connection that minors who are boys have to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah and not women. Now, we're going to see that many Rishonim took issue with this comment of the Meiri. Tosafot, for example, very interestingly, quotes the position of Rabbeinu Tam in the underlined portion. The Omer Rabbeinu Tam, the Ein Zor Ra'aya, the proof that he's not arguing on the Meiri, but he's arguing on the logic the Meiri provided earlier. Rabbeinu Tam, who by the way preceded the Meiri by a few centuries, says that this is no proof. You cannot prove from the fact that women are exempt from from the study of Torah that they cannot fulfill the mitzvah of reading from the Torah for others. Number one, because the Talmud in Masechet Megillah writes, "Hakol olim leminyan sheva, afilu isha afilu katan." Everybody may be called up for the count of the 7 aliyot of the Torah reading, including minors and including women. So, if that's true, that must be the accepted law. You can't invoke the Tosefta or other sources to exclude women from this reading. Especially if you want to say that they can't say the blessing when they're not commanded in the mitzvah. You cannot say that the Birkat Torah that's recited before the Torah reading and after the reading is something which invokes the mitzvah of studying Torah. Birkat Torah, when we go up to the Torah when we say Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim and then concluding with Asher Natan Lanu Torato, you'll notice that those are not blessings invoking the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. In fact, there is nothing about any commandment mentioned in them. They're instead what Chachamim categorize as Birkot Shevach Vehodaya. They're blessings, benedictions of berachot of thanksgiving and gratitude. So, for this reason, we're going to see in source 11, Maran, Rabbi Yosef Karo, in his most famous work, the Bet Yosef, he quotes from Rabbeinu Nisim of Verona, 14th century Spain, and concludes that they do in fact count for the purposes of being included in the mitzvah of Megillah, and for the similar reasons to what the Ritva stated, because they're not required to fill a specific quota of a minyan, we don't discriminate in their level of obligation either. Source number 12, Maran also writes in the Bet Yosef, Siman Resh Pebet. Here the discussion is with regard to the Torah reading. Third line from the bottom, Maran writes, since the rabbis of the Talmud unequivocally stated that the broad category of Jewish people, men, women, and children, may be called up and recite the blessing. You can even forget the fact that women and minors can be called up, they can even be called up for the first and final aliyah. This is a retort to some of the Rishonim. There were some Rishonim who were of the opinion that the Mishnah and Megillah that states that women can be called up to the Torah and minors can be called up only refers to either the last 4 aliyot or the last 6 aliyot, but not the first aliyah or the third aliyah or the first 3 aliyot. Vechevan de Korin, Maran concludes with pretty clear logic. Since they can fulfill the obligation of reading for others, vadai mevarachin, they can certainly also make the bracha. Just like we have Masim B'Kol Yom, the common practice, especially among Sephardim, where a minor can be called up for the maftir, he makes the bracha, and he can recite the haftarah with all its blessings as well. Now we're going to see, while this is the letter of the law, halakha l'maaseh does allow for this, the Talmud also does conclude, not with regard to Megillah reading or Hanukkah candles, but with regard to Torah reading, that they do not, women are typically not called up to read the Torah because of kavod hasibur. We still haven't defined what that is, but we will now. In source 13, the Talmud Yerushalmi writes, it's stated in the Talmud Bavli elsewhere, but it's actually applied more broadly in the Talmud Yerushalmi, chapter 3 of Yerushalmi Berachot. With regard to the Hallel, the Yerushalmi writes, Mishaya Eved or Isha or Katan, someone who has a servant or a wife or a child, Makrinoto. If he cannot recite the Hallel, they read for him. And he responds after what they say. He follows their lead. But, says the Talmud, Utelo me'era. He should have a curse fall upon him. Aval amru tavo me'era leben. I apologize. The Chachamim, according to the Yerushalmi writes, tavo me'era leben esrim shesarich leben eser. Even further, forget a woman fulfilling the obligation for a man. Someone who is a 20-year-old adult who needs a 10-year-old to read for him should also have a curse fall upon him. Now, this passage in the Yerushalmi, the final clause over here is not stated in the Talmud Bavli. It's only stated here in the Yerushalmi. That's why I quoted this. This is important because, like we're going to see in source number 15, Rashi picks up on this point. What does it mean a curse should fall upon such a person? It should fall on such a person, shelo lamad, because you're an adult. You're a Jewish adult. How could you not know how to read basic Hebrew? We're not talking about understanding what you're reading. We're not talking about reading it fluently or perfectly. We're talking about being able to read your native language, your people's language, on an elementary level. Obviously, everybody has this rule cannot be broadly applied. Everybody has their own circumstances in life and challenges that may prevent them from perhaps even being able to read Hebrew on an elementary level. And sometimes people have circumstances that prevent them from that are beyond their means of control. The Talmud's not talking about that. If you have circumstances that God is almost preventing you from being able to study the Torah in its original language, then all right, we're not going to hold that against you. But if a person is mentally capable and he has the time and he has the means and he's just negligent and doesn't learn it, then shame on you. That's what the Gemara is saying. And that's what Rashi is saying. V'im lamad, and furthermore, Rashi says, if the guy does know Hebrew, he's a learned person. Still, kavod ome'era, we should also say shame on him. Shemevazeh kono la'asot sheluchim ka'ele, because he's getting others to fulfill the mitzvot for him by having such people fulfill the mitzvah. What does it mean, such people? We do this all the time. People fulfill mitzvot for us all the time. When you go to synagogue, unless you're, we're going to see in a second, the best way to fulfill the mitzvah of hearing the Torah is if you're called up, you read your own Torah portion. But not everybody gets to get called up. Only 7 people get to get called up. So what about the rest of the people? The rest of the people can listen, and that's fine. They can fulfill their obligation through the one who is reciting the Torah. Or Kiddush. Usually one person recites the Kiddush, everybody fulfills their obligation. Shomea kaoneh, this is the famous rule of the Talmud, Masechet Sukkah, and other places writes, that a person who hears the mitzvah or the blessing or the recitation that is required of them also fulfills their obligation. So what does Rashi mean when he says that shame on this person that he's having such people fulfill the mitzvah for him? For this, I found a very interesting, it's a question that bothered me for some time, but I found in Tosafot HaRosh, Rabbeinu Asher, not in his halachic work, but in the his personal commentary to the Talmud, he writes very interestingly. We read the Gadol Makreoto. An adult may read the Hallel for the person, and that's fine, right? Even though in those portions of the Hallel where we respond Hallelujah, back then they used to recite Hallelujah, the whole institution of reciting Hallel is a big balagan. Harambam writes in Ilchot Tefillah that I have seen many communities, I'm paraphrasing, I have seen many communities have different practices regarding the recitation of the Hallel, and every community does a different thing, and it's a free-for-all, it's the Wild West. But I'm going to tell you, Harambam says, how to do the Hallel according to our practice. So, anyway, an adult can have the mitzvah of Hallel be fulfilled for him by listening to it, even if he does not respond Hallelujah or Amen, let's say, to brachot. V'nafik b'shmiya lechuda. But and he fulfills his obligation by simply listening to it. La kalai. In this case, he is not given this shame on you, this curse. Kevan de gadol bar piyuvahu, because the one fulfilling the obligation for him is one who is fully obligated in the mitzvah. But I should have read this earlier. I apologize. If you go back to the beginning of this comment from Tosafot HaRosh, he says the curse does fall on a person. The shame on you falls on a person. Sheoselo shaliach, that has somebody else fulfill the mitzvah for him, the la bar chiyuva kalayete. The eved veisha la mechayeve b'halel. The mitzvah says yazman gerama. The Hallel is a time-bound mitzvah. Therefore, women are not obligated in the Hallel. Side point, very important side point though, is a very interesting discussion about women being obligated in Hallel of Pesach and Hanuka. There were some Acharonim, contemporary rabbinical authorities, who did include them in the mitzvah of Hallel for these days because of their general inclusion due to the Afen Hayuba Otoanes, their in-debt nature for showing thanksgiving and gratitude for being saved from death and destruction. All right, but that's a very insightful comment from Rabbeinu Asher, and so now we can better understand why Chachamim used such a harsh language. It's not wrong that someone else is fulfilling the obligation for a Jewish adult man. It's problematic when you're having to resort to having women and children who are not obligated in these mitzvot fulfill the mitzvah for you. Now, keep in mind, if you go back to the Ritva's comments, the Ritva equates kavod hatzibur with tavolo me'era. Ergo, a woman may fulfill the obligation of a man in Torah reading, but it's improper. It's improper because they're not obligated in Talmud Torah. And yeah, you can respond like Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam would disagree, and he would say that this has nothing to do with the Talmud Torah. This is a totally different institution. The Torah reading is a totally different institution relative to the general mitzvah of Talmud Torah. But excluding Rabbeinu Tam, the Ritva would say where a woman is not obligated, but she's fulfilling the mitzvah for a man, shame on the man. Where they are equally obligated, this certainly does not apply. Which also would mean, according to the Ritva, according to Rabbeinu Nisim, and according to Maran and others, there is absolutely no reservation, even post facto, even after the fact, for a woman to read the Megillah or to light the Hanukkah candles for one's household or for even a single man or a group of men. No reservation whatsoever there. Source 17, this is a very good source for everybody to know. The Or Zarua quotes in the name of his father-in-law the reason why the Chazan this is already in the 13th century, in Franco-German Jewry, in those Ashkenazi communities, practice was that a single reader would recite the Torah for the community. Unlike many Sephardic communities in Temanim until today, where each person getting called up would read his portion. And he says the reason for that is and so because people were not as educated, unfortunately, in medieval Europe, in the reading of the Hebrew language or of the Torah and its nuances of vowels and ta'amim. Therefore, we try not to embarrass people by having a single reader. And he says that's very similar to what the Mishnah in Bikurim says, where the recitation of the Bikurim from the Torah, where it says, Ve'anita v'amarta lifnei Adonai Elohecha, arami ovedavi. There's a whole paragraph from the Torah that one has to recite from Parashat Kitavo when one brings the Bikurim to the Kohen. So the Mishnah says that originally each person would recite it, but people didn't know what they were doing. So the Kohen would recite the portion, and then the one bringing the Bikurim would repeat after him in order not to have people embarrassed and consequently to not bring the Bikurim in the first place. So that's a very interesting insight from the Or Zarua. And that leads us to source number 19 and 20. We'll do these outside for the sake of time. I know we're pressed on time over here. And we'll conclude with these points. Over here. Ham ben Zion Abba Shaul in his Or LeZion writes that normally we're concerned because the tzibur, out of kavod tzibur, we don't want a woman to fulfill the mitzvah of reading the Torah for others. But let's say everybody in the minyan, which happens to also include women, are learned people. They're not, we're not dealing with the general public. Everybody there can read the Torah perfectly with no issue. Here, Chacham Ben Zion says, it would appear that you can make a case that would allow even even in an ideal fashion, for the women in that group. Let's say it's like a family. You have an extended family. They're in the hotel. They make minyan. Everybody there is on the same page. Nobody is concerned for their dignity. So, yeah, maybe women can be called up for the Torah in such a situation. He says, he says at the end of the day, though, I need to look into this further. But keep in mind, this only works according to the approach of Rabbeinu Tam and according to the approach of Or Zarua. Rabbeinu Tam and Or Zarua have no concern for this obligation of this connection with Torah reading being related to women's obligation in studying the Torah. The two are completely unrelated, and instead this has to do with embarrassment, just like the Or Zarua related about the reason why we have a single chazan nowadays. It shouldn't be like that, but that's the reality. But according to Rabbeinu Asher, according to the Rosh, that's a totally different story. Chacham Ben Zion did not bring this passage from Tosafot Rosh in his Teshuvah, in his response over here. So I don't know what Chacham Ben Zion would say in response to that. But he does entertain this possibility where one has a quote-unquote private minyan. And last but not least, because this always gets asked every single year when people bring up the topic of Megillah reading. What about Kol Isha? What about the restriction the Gemara in Brachot relates regarding women singing? Women cannot sing in public. It's immodest. It's erva. Sedech Chemed v'Chizkiah Medini, perhaps one of the greatest rabbinical minds of the past 2 centuries. He was a 19th century Chacham. Tremendous encyclopedic mind. His work, Sedech Chemed, is one of the most comprehensive encyclopedias of Jewish law and history. he writes something very interesting. He says, where it is, and by the way, this is in Klal Kof, Siman Membet. He writes, when does Kol Be'isha Erva apply? According to many Rishonim, it only applies when one is reciting the Shema. You can't have these distractions during the Shema. But even if you want to be super religious, I never listen to women sing. Okay. You know when that restriction applies? That only applies when they are singing Divrei Cheshek Ushtut. Divrei Hevel Ba'agavim, where they are singing in the typical manner that we associate singing with, at the very worst, songs that are provocative in nature, and at the very best, songs that are benign, but they're not in any way related to Shirot Tishbachot, songs of praise to Borei Olam, to God, or certainly words of the Torah, of the prophets, of Tehillim. But here, Sedechemed writes, Chachamim never meant to restrict singing of a woman where he gives two examples, where she is singing the words of the Torah, or where she is singing certainly parts of mitzvot that she is obligated in, like the reading of the Megillah. This, by the way, this obviously doesn't apply to Hanukkah because there's no element of reciting anything during Hanukkah. But there it certainly does not apply. And also where women are involved in singing lullabies to children, or if they're eulogizing. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful position he takes. If they're singing praises to God, bishvil nes, in honor, in commemoration of a miracle, right? Or she's lost singing lullabies. Or if they're eulogizing and singing very sad songs at a eulogy. Let lan ba. We are not concerned for kol isha. Nobody intends on deriving any sort of lustful pleasure during these things, during these instances of singing. And you'll forgive me, but if that's where your head is at during these major life cycle events in our calendar, then the problem is with you, not with the woman. And with that, we conclude, and I will gladly take any questions.
I'm happy to kick off if no one's got anything else, or if we're too late for anyone with anything else. One of the issues that a lot of the Chachamim raised was women and men being on a different level of obligation, and therefore potentially an issue with women fulfilling the obligation for men if there's a different level there. So I just wanted to bring from Hilchot Berachot, from Mishneh Torah, something interesting that Harambam brings. He brings, as you said, that כל השומע ברכה מן הברכות מתחילה ועד סופה ונתכוון לשאת בה ידי חובתו יצא. ואף על פי שלא ענה אמן. So he fulfills his obligation even without saying amen. וכל העונה אמן אחר המברך הרי זה כמברך. והוא שיהיה כמברך חייב באותה ברכה. If the one blessing is חייב in the ברכה, they're considered as the person who was making the ברכה. היה מברך חייב מדברי סופרים והעונה חייב מן התורה. לא יצא ידי חובתו עד שיענה. So Harambam seems to bring that even if they're in a different position of obligation, by saying Amen, one sort of fulfills their need. And so, how would they sort of respond to this halakha? That even if there's a differing level of obligation, as long as they're both obligated and the person says Amen, the man has basically done their job.
That's a good question. That is a very good question. I don't know. I would have to look into it. You have any other questions? All right.
I'm not seeing any more hands, so assuming we don't have any more questions, I think that's good evening to everyone. Thank you, Chacham, once again for an excellent shiur. And I believe we're on break now for the next few weeks, but see everyone back when we return with shiurim again in January. Thank you, everyone.
An early Hanukkah, Happy Hanukkah to everybody.
Hanukkah Sameach.